I'll just sit right next to you. I'll be this back there out the back.
He didn't know.
I guess that'll be How are you?
No.
You have to chat to Tom. You know who this is? It was married to Larry. This is Martha. Remember, we had two Martha Davises in the family worldwide. But I go by Kim, so that helped. Yeah. Thank you. This was all on.
So
Good afternoon. Before I get started, I would like, on behalf of the family, to invite everyone to join the family at Beinke's this afternoon after the graveside service. We would like to spend some time with all of you who come out. The wisest man that ever lived, King Solomon, wrote of the process of growing old in Ecclesiastes 12. In this book he wrote, "So remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of adversity come and the years approach when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light are darkened, and the moon and the stars and the clouds return after the rain. On the day when the guardians of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, the women who grind cease because they are few, and the ones who watch through the window see dimly. The doors of the street are shut while the sound of the meal fades, when one rises at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of song grow faint. Also they are afraid of heights and dangers on the road. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper loses its spring, and the caperberry has no effect. For man is headed to his eternal home, and there is mourning in the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped and the gold bowl is broken, and the jar is shattered at the spring, and the wheel is broken into the well, and the dust returns to the earth as it once was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. We are here today because the spirit of our loved one, James Weber Davis, my grandfather, has returned to the God who gave it. And soon the body which held that spirit for so very, very, very long will return to the earth as it once was. As I was thinking and preparing this message, I couldn't help but think about how life is so full of mysteries, and we will never know the answer to most of them. Like some people live only a few years and others live very long and full lives. Some age gracefully while others do not. Some have good health most of their life, and some struggle with their health for years. Some suffer the effects of debilitating diseases like Alzheimer's. And some keep sharp minds until they die. Some are taken from us way too soon, and some seem to linger on in agony and sorrow. Death is a mystery. But one thing that is not a mystery is that it is certain. It is certain. Two things you can count on: death and taxes. We are all going to die. Now that may seem sad and depressing to some, and that is understandable, because with death comes loss for those of us who are left behind. But even though death is certain and is waiting for us all, death does not have to be the sad and depressing thing that we all fear and loathe. But it is not to be feared, because we can be sure that death is not the end of life. Only the end of life in a tired and worn out body. Weber Davis has been gone from us for some time now. His spirit was broken and his mind has been wandering around, lost and confused and unable to find its way out for some time. And even though he lived almost 96 years, the last few have not been years that any of us would want for ourselves or even want it for him. As Solomon describes, Weber's spirit has finally found its way out of the dark and has gone to be with God. He is finally free, and for that I am happy. He is at peace. And today we can celebrate and remember the life that he lived. As I was thinking this week, there was so much in the book of Ecclesiastes that I thought applied to my grandfather. Just the way that he lived and the way that he died. As Solomon said in chapter 3, God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity into the hearts of men. Yet they cannot fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is a gift from God. And in chapter 8, Solomon writes, So I commend the enjoyment of life, because nothing is better for a man under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany him in his work all the days of the life God has given him under the sun. Now, there's one thing that I can say about Weber Davis, and it is that he was blessed by God beyond measure. God poured down gifts upon this man his entire life. I don't know why. I don't know if it was a reward for hardships suffered early in life. I don't know if it was an attempt by God to get his attention and say, here I am, everything that I've given you is for me. I don't know. I just know that if eating and drinking and finding satisfaction in life is a gift from God, God gave freely to Weber Davis. If you ask me to describe my grandfather, there's a lot of words that come to mind. Most of the people who came by last night just looked at him and said, that was a good man. And that is true. But those of us in the family may have a few other words that come to mind when we think of Weber Davis. There are times that he could be mean. Mean as a snake sometimes. Just ask some of the nursing home workers that had to attend to him. They've got the bruises to prove it. And me and Stephen lived with him for a few years in our middle school years. And if we were making too much noise upstairs, he would come busting in the door, whipping off his belt and swinging at us. And I can say that I never got hit with the belt because I learned early on I didn't have to be faster than the belt. I just had to be faster than Stephen. Another word that comes to mind is stubborn. Yeah, I hear some, yeah. You know, he could be stubborn. He had an extra dose of that Davis stubbornness. And prideful. He could be the epitome of pride. He had an opinion about everything, and his opinion was the only opinion that was right. And he would not hold back in sharing it with you, even if you didn't want to hear it. And as he grew older, these characteristics kind of seemed to grow stronger and stronger and stronger until, unfortunately, that's what we most remember about him, and not the real man that he was. Because on the other hand, he could be one of the friendliest, nicest, best people that you could ever hope to meet. Everyone around this town, when you mention my grandfather, only has one thing to say. He was a good man. It's been almost half a century since he was sheriff. Half a century, and people still in this town think fondly of him. Even though he could be stubborn and prideful, he could also be smart and full of wisdom. Let's just say, if you take all these things and wrap them up into the man that Weber Davis was, he was a character if there ever was one. You know, I wrote about my grandfather. And my grandfather was a great man. In fact, he's the greatest man that I ever knew. He was a soldier, a policeman, a sheriff, a farmer, and a businessman. He was a man of adventure, always telling stories that I would have loved to have lived out myself. If I could live a life other than my own, it would be his that I would want to live. Now, how can I say that about a man that I just described as stubborn and prideful and sometimes a bit mean? Is this just funeral talk? No. Absolutely not. Because if you look at where this man started in life, what he went through, and where he ended up, it's an amazing story. A story that should inspire us all. It's the story of America and opportunity. It's the story of persistence and rising above adversity. And he doesn't just represent himself. He represents an entire generation of Americans that have been called America's greatest generation. And they were called that for good reason. They survived adversity and hardship. They stood up and fought against evil and for God and country. They sacrificed more than any generation before. They built the greatest country and they built the greatest economy that history has ever known. let me give a brief family history lesson because I know that there's some in this room that likes that sort of thing. The Davis family was one of the first families to immigrate to the New World from England. I don't know if many knew this. Robert Davis from Bedfordshire, England, arrived at the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638. That's just 18 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. 18 years. And the descendants of Robert Davis migrated from New Hampshire down to Connecticut, into Virginia, and then to Kentucky in the early 1800s when a man named Elijah Davis moved to Scott County, Kentucky by 1810. Elijah's son, Jonathan G. Davis, married a Harrison County native and settled in Turkeyfoot in Scott County. Now, I wouldn't know where Turkeyfoot was it not for all those endless drives that Weber took me on. It was from Jonathan G. and this family that the town of Davis got its name. Jonathan G. and his wife gave birth to Jonathan William Davis in 1846 in Turkeyfoot. This was Papaw's grandfather. Now, this Jonathan married Sarah Alice Kitchen and gave birth in 1888 to William Harrison Davis. William Harrison married Alma Frances Giles, and they had several children, one of which was James Weber Davis, born on October 10, 1918. Now, Alma Frances, Weber's mother, died at 37 years old when Weber was just 9 years old. Am I getting this right, Mom? So at 9 years old, Weber had already lost his mother and went to live with his aunt. And we all know that he had to walk all the way to school from Davis to Sadieville, uphill, both ways, through driving snow, and at the threat of murderers and bandits along the way. The Great Depression hit when he was in his early teens. He talked about not having food and snow blowing in through the cracks in the house. You know, none of us in this room knows what that's like. We don't know what it's like to grow up in those conditions. These experiences would shape who he would become and why he was the way that he was, good and bad. There were no food stamps or welfare back then to get you through the tough years. You know, his teenage years were full of adventures that today would make front page news and have his parents in jail. One night he hopped a freight car at Sadieville with a friend and rode it through the night to Cincinnati. And he spent the night eluding railroad detectives and exploring the downtown of Cincinnati. He met John Dillinger at a Davis, Kentucky gas station just a few months before the notorious outlaw was gunned down in Chicago. By the time he was 17, he had enlisted in the U.S. Army at Fort Thomas, Kentucky. Now, this was not the army of jeeps and troop transports and tanks. It was the army of horses and mules and walking everywhere you went. His unit would often march from Fort Thomas to Fort Knox, Kentucky. That would be outlawed in the Army today as cruel and dangerous. But Weber Davis did it. He did it. He was in the Army for 4 years the first time, making about $20 a month. He got out of the Army and made the smartest decision of his life. He married Flossie Joy Rogers. But even at this time in his life, he was poor. Dirt poor. He didn't even have the money to pay the doctor who delivered his first child's Phyllis, even though he had known for 9 months that she was coming. A fact which the doctor was quick to point out to him. By 1944, he was back in the Army, and he didn't have to be. He was exempt for a number of reasons, but the country was at war. He went and served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. His experiences in the war are just as interesting, and his experiences had to again shape the man that he was. Do you realize 407,000 U.S. soldiers died in World War II to defeat the Axis powers? 407,000 young men, just like Weber Davis, didn't come home. So he experienced death and destruction. We don't know what that's like today. And we can't comprehend those numbers. Just to put it in perspective, my generation lost 6,000 people in Iraq. And we're tired of war. And we're scarred. His generation lost blood and life like no other before. And they didn't complain. And they didn't whine. And they didn't put their head in the sand. Like so many of his generation, Weber felt a deep, deep love for his country and was very patriotic all his life. That's why the flag over the coffin is so much more appropriate than any flower arrangements that we could have put there. You know, after the war, he worked farms and other jobs until he eventually opened a store in Connersville that he ran for many years before becoming a police officer for the city of Cynthiana. He very quickly became the chief of police and then deputy sheriff and finally sheriff of Harrison County. He finished his career working second shift at the water treatment plant until he retired. When I look back at this life, what an interesting life. During which he and Flossie raised 3 wonderful children and enjoyed 57 years of marriage before she moved on to be with the Lord at 78 years old. My goodness, what a life! What an adventure! And like I said before, these experiences, especially the ones early on, shaped who he was. And who was he? Well, living through the Great Depression made Weber one of the tightest people I have ever known. Having grown up with nothing made him hold on to everything. He had an air conditioner in the house. And I can only remember twice that thing was even turned on. Because he had to save electricity. It had to be like 105 degrees before the air conditioner would come on. Remember that, Steve? Did you even know it worked? I can remember it being 100 degrees in the shade outside and my grandmother standing over the stove canning green beans or tomatoes or cooking supper for somebody and the air conditioner still wouldn't be on. And I don't ever remember us eating out much. I mean, why eat out when you had a wife at home to cook for you every day? And if this man knew how much money that coffin cost, he would be rolling out of it right now. And we went with one of the cheapest models. He wanted to be buried in a cardboard box to save money. He was the ultimate pack rat, holding on to everything in case you might need something. When we moved out of the house, it was full of useless stuff. Fighting in World War II made him hate everybody that wasn't an American. I remember when Toyota came to Georgetown. It was the first wave of the Japanese invasion to take over America. He really expected the Japanese and Chinese to enslave us all, and he warned me over and over and over that I would live at the end of a Japanese bayonet before I died. He learned to cook in the army for soldiers. And he somehow got it into his mind that the way you cooked for soldiers was good. Salt was his favorite ingredient. Yes, and the saltier, the better it was for you. Luckily, Flossie cooked most of the time or we would all have high blood pressure. He was a survivor. He survived the Great Depression. He survived losing his mother at an early age. He survived World War II. He survived his ship catching fire. He survived the Japanese trying to kill him. He survived being shot at as a police officer. He even survived his grandson marrying a black woman. That was something that most in the family thought that would kill him. And he survived the election of a black president, although he was none too happy about the fact and would tell you what he thought. His idea of fun and entertainment seemed to be working in the garden. And Stephen and I spent many a day out in the hot sun at Martha's Place, working in that garden. He never went to movies. He didn't really like music and told me he wouldn't walk across the street to see Elvis Presley if somebody paid him. And you know, even with all of his faults and quirks, I owe so much of who I am to who he was. He taught me to save my money and stay out of debt. I learned to be tight just like him. Except I will turn the air conditioner on when it hits 100, not 105. He always stressed education to me. And he helped me go to college by saving the child support checks that my dad would send my mom. I would not have been able to go if it weren't for him and his wisdom and insight. He taught me to take care of myself, and I tried to listen to him. He said, don't smoke, and I didn't. He said, don't do drugs, and I didn't. He taught me to eat well and work hard, and I have. He said, don't drink too heavily. A beer every once in a while is okay. I listened to what this man taught me. And as I have, my life has turned out more blessed than I could have possibly ever imagined. Because whether we want to admit it or not, he knew what he was talking about. He absolutely loved this country. And I think I learned that from him. When I joined the United States Army, I got to serve in the same regiment that he did, the 10th Infantry Regiment. But he didn't just love the United States of America. He loved this country. He loved its hills and its valleys and its fields and its streams. After he lost his wife and son, the only solace and happiness that he seemed to find was driving the backcountry roads of this country. He would drive the roads of Harrison, Scott, Grant, Robertson, Bracken, and he would even sometimes adventure into southern Ohio and get lost. I mean, what else do you have to do when you're 90 years old, all your peers and friends are dead, you've lost your wife and son, and your grandkids have moved away and are living their own lives? According to him, he's had one foot in the grave for the last 30 years. But I know this. He knew God. Maybe not the way that we think or that we know God. But he acknowledged that God existed. And that God held everything within his hand. And he loved God's creation. And it would bring tears to his eyes as he was out driving and looking at all that God had created. He was a baptized believer in the Christian church, which, by the way, is the only true church according to his interpretation of Acts 11:26, where it says the disciples were called Christians. So all you Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, you better get right. On the Sunday that he was ordained deacon at Central Christian Church, the church building fell down. What a way to start your deaconship. And I hate to think that what we are going to remember the most about this man's almost 96 years of life is the last 10 years, when he was suffering and when he wasn't himself. Think about it for a minute. This man was born in the days of horse and buggies and ended up seeing man land on the moon. He lived not just through the most devastating war in history, but through 50 years of the Cold War with the threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over your head with every decision that was made in Moscow and Washington. He lived through 17 presidents. 17. And saw the assassination of one of them. He even stopped by and had dinner with one president who had been dead for over 100 years. Abraham Lincoln. Weber Davis needs to be remembered not for the way he lived the last few years of his life, but he needs to be remembered for the way he lived his whole life. He was representative of the greatest American generation to ever live. A generation of hard workers and fighters. A generation of heroes who put their lives on the line and was willing to stand up for American values and what they believed that God was calling them to do. This was a generation that survived when there was no safety net of government handouts or assistance if you didn't have something. You weren't given assistance because you lost a job or was emotionally scarred from war. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. If you didn't have the money, you did without. You relied on yourself, your family, and your neighbors in the hand of God, not the hand of Uncle Sam. You survived or you didn't. They survived. They conquered and they excelled in everything that they did. They built America into the superpower that it is today. The credit goes to America's greatest generation and to the men and women of that generation. Men and women like Weber Davis and Flossie Davis. Tom Brokaw wrote of my grandfather's generation. They answered the call to save the world from the two most powerful and ruthless machines ever assembled. Instruments of conquest in the hands of fascist maniacs. They faced great odds and a late start, but they did not protest. They succeeded on every front. As they now reach the twilight of their adventurous and productive lives, they remain, for the most part, exceptionally modest. In a deep sense, they didn't think that what they were doing was that special, because everyone else was doing it too. My grandfather, like the men and women of his generation, was a hero from a generation of heroes. That's how I want to remember the man. And that's why I can call him the greatest man that I ever knew. As I close, I come back to the book of Ecclesiastes. In that book, Solomon seeks out meaning in life. He knows that there has to be something more than the life which he sees. He looks for it in education. He looks for it in wealth. He looks for it in public works. And he looks for it in work. And the conclusion that he comes to is that this life, when it's all over, everything is meaningless. Wealth, you can't take it with you. Education and wisdom, even the wisest of us are going to end up at the same place as the most foolish. The work that you do, it will be forgotten. So while we are here on earth, the only thing that we can do is eat, drink, and enjoy life. Because our lives are gifts from God. Every waking moment is a gift to be treasured and enjoyed. And in the end, we're all going to die and return to God. Solomon said, and listen carefully to his words, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure with them." You can see this lived out in Weber's life. To me, he always seemed happy and content with whatever he had or whatever he didn't have. Until he had to say goodbye to his wife of 57 years. Flossie Davis was the heart of the family. Weber has lived for 18 years with part of his heart gone. And the only pleasure that he could find in this world was driving around the country. I think it helped get his mind off all that he had lost and off of his inability to find meaning for his life, which had always, from the very beginning, had purpose and meaning. When all that was taken away from him, there was no more pleasure in living, and you could see it. If there's one final lesson here that Weber Davis could teach us, it would be the words of Solomon. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. You know, folks, we have to live life to the full while we have it to live. Eat, drink, and enjoy your toll. That's biblical wisdom, and it's the way Weber lived. To hell with what everybody else around you is doing and thinks. Eat, drink, and enjoy your toil while you are young. Remember God while you're young. Serve Him while you're young. Enjoy His gifts and His blessings while you're young. Weber told me on more than one occasion that it was hell growing old. And he should know. He's been growing old for as long as I've known him. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and obey His commands, for that is the whole duty of man. I believe that Weber Davis did this to the best of his ability and gifts. And now his time on earth is through. And his spirit has gone on to be with God, with his fathers, and with his wife and son. And now it is left to us to do the same. Enjoy the gifts of God while we can. And make the best life we can for ourselves and our family. Rising above the obstacles, rising above the adversity. Because it doesn't matter how poor you are when you start. You can do it. It doesn't matter what is against you when you start. You can rise above all the obstacles and adversity. This man, Weber Davis, showed us how to do that. If you make good decisions, fear God, and work hard, you can survive. And along the way, eat, drink, and be merry. It's biblical. Let us pray. Dear awesome Almighty God, we thank you so much. Not for this day when we mourn our grandfather, our father, our uncle, our friend, but on this day that we can celebrate. And we can celebrate the example of a life, of not just his, but an entire generation that put others' interests above their own. A generation that did what they felt you were calling them to do. A generation that no matter the odds, no matter the adversity, no matter the obstacles that stood in their way, they rose above it. And they hammered out a life that we can look back and be proud of. Dear Father, Almighty God, a spirit is coming to you now that, in 2 words, was a good man. Accept him into your arms. Comfort him, because now he is free and now he is at peace. And for this we thank you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.